The stars of the surreal dominion shone brightly across 1,000 worlds, and at the heart of it all stood the royal palace of Queen Aria. She was known across the galaxy as a wise and noble leader, one who balanced kindness with firm judgment. Her people respected her, her council trusted her, and even foreign rulers admired her steady voice during times of trouble. Yet behind her calm eyes was a private world of grief, for Queen Aria carried a wound that never healed. Long ago, during the most uncertain days of her reign, she had lost her only daughter. The princess was young when the uprising began. Her name was Selene, a child with curious eyes who loved to wander through the palace gardens and ask endless questions about the stars. She would often stand at the tall windows of the palace and point to the glittering constellations, telling her mother that one day she would visit them all. Queen Aria would smile at her daughter's dreams, and for a brief time, the palace was filled with light laughter. But history would not allow those days to last. The uprising had not started suddenly. For years, whispers of dissatisfaction spread through distant colonies. Traders grumbled about taxes, governors complained about resources, and some groups longed for independence from the Dominion. At first, these voices seemed small, scattered, and without unity. Yet slowly they connected across the stars, finding strength in their shared unrest. When at last the fires of rebellion lit across several sectors, the Dominion faced a storm it had not expected. The palace became a place of worry. Counselors gathered daily, maps were unrolled, and messages from governors arrived filled with urgent warnings. Through it all, Queen Aria remained steady in her role, showing no fear in front of her people. She believed the Dominion would endure as it always had, through patience and careful strategy. But the one thing she did not expect was how quickly the uprising would strike at the very heart of her home. It was during one such council meeting that the danger arrived. The palace alarms echoed through the halls as reports rushed in that a rebel fleet had entered the system. The defenses of the capital world were strong, but the suddenness of the attack unsettled even the bravest commanders. The queen gave swift orders, ensuring the safety of her ministers and preparing her guards for defense. But her first thought, above all, was for her daughter. Selene had been in the royal gardens that morning, attended by her caretakers. When the alarm sounded, they hurried her toward the secure chambers beneath the palace, as they had been trained to do. The child, though frightened, held tightly to her caretaker's hand. The great stone corridors echoed with hurried footsteps as they sought safety. None of them could have known that history was turning at that very moment. The uprising did not succeed in taking the capital. The Dominion fleet fought bravely, and the palace was defended until the threat retreated. Yet when the smoke cleared and order returned, the queen was met with the most painful truth. In the confusion during the rush of the evacuation, her daughter was gone. No one could explain exactly how. Some said the child had been lost in the chaos of the fleeing crowds. Others believed she had been taken by those who had infiltrated the city. A few insisted she had been hidden away by loyalists and that one day she would be found. But certainty never came. Selene, the light of the queen's life, had vanished. From that day forward, the palace no longer echoed with laughter. Queen Aria stood before her people with the same dignity as always, yet those close to her saw how her heart had been broken. Each decision she made carried the weight of her sorrow, for she ruled not only as a leader but as a mother who had lost what was most precious to her. Songs were sung about her patience and stories were told of her strength. Yet none could erase the silence that followed her through the halls of her home. The people of the Dominion mourned with their queen. Across the stars, prayers and messages of hope were sent. Search parties traveled to distant systems, chasing rumors of a child with royal markings. Explorers carried the queen's request wherever they traveled. If any should find her daughter, they would be honored forever. Yet the years passed without an answer. As worlds rebuilt and the uprising faded into memory, the story of the lost princess became legend. Children were told tales of her as if she were a figure from myth, a symbol of loss and hope together. Queen Aria never stopped searching. Every ship that arrived at the palace carried her unspoken question. Every report from the frontier was examined with care. Even when the galaxy grew quieter and her council begged her to set aside the sorrow, she would not. In private moments, when no one else was near, she would look out the same tall windows her daughter once loved, gazing at the constellations and whispering that one day she would return. She held on to that dream even when logic told her it was impossible. The palace staff often spoke of those quiet nights. They would see the queen standing in her flowing robes, the light of the stars painting her face, and they would lower their voices out of respect. They knew she was not just a ruler of worlds, but a mother who had been forced to wait in silence. And though many had moved on, her sorrow reminded them that the galaxy was not only made of power and trade, but of families, bonds, and hearts that could be broken. In time, the Dominion grew strong again. The uprising became a subject for historians, something studied in academies rather than feared in daily life. The Queen's reign endured, and peace returned to most of her worlds. Yet despite her many victories, the people always remembered that their ruler had given more than anyone should. She had given her joy, her laughter, her child, and so her name was spoken not only with respect but with tenderness, for even the proudest governors felt her pain as their own. The story of the lost princess lived on through song and art. Poets described the child as a star who had fallen into the void. Painters captured her image based on the queen's memories, showing her in radiant colors with eyes filled with dreams. Travelers from other civilizations heard these tales and carried them back to their own people. Thus, the legend of the vanished princess spread farther than the Dominion itself, touching hearts across cultures and reminding all who heard it of the fragility of life. And so, as years turned into decades, the queen remained at her post, guiding her people with wisdom and strength, even as her heart carried the weight of absence. She never remarried, never spoke of another heir. To her there was only one daughter, and her place could never be taken. To many it seemed as if the story had ended with loss, yet time has a way of weaving unexpected patterns, and fate often waits patiently before revealing its next chapter. The queen could not know it then, but beyond the edges of her dominion, far across forgotten trade routes and hidden settlements, her daughter still lived. She was no longer the child who had once asked questions in the gardens, but a young woman with her own story. And though the galaxy believed she was gone forever, destiny was quietly preparing to bring her home. Far from the palace of Queen Aria, beyond the bright trade routes and the great stations of the Dominion, space stretched out in wide silence. Few traveled in those forgotten paths, for they were filled with abandoned colonies, broken outposts, and stories of the uprising that had left scars across the stars. It was into this quiet that a human traveler named Thomas made his way. Thomas was not a soldier, nor was he a man of high position. He was a wanderer, one who carried curiosity like a flame that never dimmed. Where many looked at the empty stretches of the galaxy and saw danger or waste, Thomas saw questions waiting to be answered. His small ship was not powerful, but it was sturdy, with storage filled mostly with charts, old journals, and instruments to record what he found. He traveled alone, yet he never felt lonely, for the stars had always been his companions. Humans were still a relatively new presence in the great halls of interstellar politics. Other species often looked at them with mixed feelings, not knowing whether to consider them fragile or formidable. They did not have the largest fleets or the oldest empires, but they had a way of reaching places where others would not go. They carried with them a stubbornness that made them continue long after others had given up. Tomas, though unknown beyond a few trading posts, carried that very spirit with him. One evening, as his ship drifted past the remains of an abandoned mining station, Tomas caught a signal. At first it was faint, almost hidden under static, but its rhythm caught his ear. It was not a distress call, nor was it a standard beacon. Curious, Thomas slowed his ship and adjusted his instruments. The signal repeated, weak but steady, as if waiting for someone to notice. With patience, he traced it to a small planet that barely appeared on modern charts. The world was quiet, covered in pale forests and wide plains. Old landing pads rusted under the sun, and structures half buried in sand showed that settlers had once tried to build a life there. Thomas brought his ship down carefully, his boots pressing into soil that had not seen travelers in many years. The air was thin but breathable, the silence broken only by the wind. Somewhere among the ruins, the signal continued its patient call. He followed it to a weathered building, its walls cracked but still standing. Inside, among dust and broken equipment, he found a recorder still running after all those years. Its power source had been patched together, wires twisted and replaced by steady hands. The recorder did not carry a message of distress, but instead a record of names, dates, and caretaking. It spoke of a child brought here during the days of the uprising, hidden away for safety, raised in secrecy. The words were simple, but Thomas felt the weight of history in them. For hours he sat in that ruined hall listening. The notes told of a little girl who grew into youth on this quiet world, never told the full story of where she came from. She had been cared for by settlers who promised to protect her, though they themselves were poor and scattered. The record ended suddenly, with no clear answer as to what became of her after those first years. Yet Thomas knew enough. This was no ordinary child. The details matched the stories he had heard in ports and stations, stories of the daughter of Queen Arya who had been lost during the uprising. He left the recorder in its place but carried a copy of its files. On his ship he studied them with care. The child had been called Alira by those who raised her, a name given to her by settlers who loved her as their own. The journals spoke of her kindness, of her curiosity about the stars, and of the strange mark upon her wrist that glowed faintly under certain light. Thomas remembered the songs sung in Dominion taverns, songs that spoke of a princess marked by starlight. The match was too clear to be coincidence. The next step was uncertain. Thomas could have turned back, carrying his discovery to the nearest station. Yet he knew such news would not remain safe. Many would see the return of the lost princess as an opportunity for power. Some might try to use her name, while others might fear what her presence would mean for the Dominion. Thomas decided instead to follow the trail himself, not for power but for the simple reason that he could not ignore it. His nature as a human, curious and persistent, would not let him walk away. With new determination, he searched old records, piecing together where the settlers might have gone after leaving the ruined outpost. Clues pointed to a small colony far deeper in the frontier, one hardly visited by traders. It was a long journey, and the maps showed hazards along the way, but Thomas prepared his ship without hesitation. As he set his course, he thought of the queen who had waited so many years. He wondered if she still believed her daughter was alive, or if she had resigned herself to sorrow. He whispered to the stars that if he found her, he would bring her home. The journey took weeks. Thomas crossed quiet sectors, passing derelict stations and lonely worlds. His ship creaked with age, yet it carried him faithfully. Along the way, he imagined what he would say if he found Alira. He practiced words of care, hoping not to frighten her with talk of royalty or destiny. He reminded himself that she was not just a story from the past, but a living person who had built her own life. At last, he reached the colony. It was small, with only a few clusters of buildings and farms under the soft glow of the planet's twin suns. Life here was simple. The people greeted him with caution, but also with the quiet hospitality of those who rarely saw strangers. They asked little of him and gave him a place to rest. Thomas observed them with interest, noticing how they spoke often of one young woman who helped in nearly every task. They described her as strong, patient, and gifted with a way of calming disputes. Her name, they said, was Alira. When he saw her for the first time, Thomas felt the weight of his discovery settle into certainty. She was no longer the child described in the records, but a young woman, graceful yet grounded, with eyes that seemed to carry both light and distance. On her wrist, faint under the sun, was the mark of starlight. She laughed easily with the settlers, carrying baskets of fruit and speaking with warmth to everyone around her. She looked nothing like the painted images he had seen of Queen Arya, yet something in her posture and presence carried that same quiet strength. Thomas did not reveal the truth at once. Instead, he watched, learning who she was in this new life. Alira seemed content, yet now and then, he saw her pause to gaze at the horizon as if waiting for something she could not name. She had dreams perhaps of another place beyond the colony. He wondered how much she suspected about her origins. Did she know she was not truly one of the settlers? Did she feel the missing pieces of her past? When at last he spoke with her, he chose simple words. He introduced himself as a traveler, one who collected stories of the past. He told her of the uprising and the legends of the lost princess. She listened with wide eyes, curious but cautious. When he gently mentioned the mark upon her wrist, she glanced down and admitted she had always wondered why it was there. He did not press further that night, but he saw the questions begin to stir within her. Thomas knew this was only the beginning. He had found the one the galaxy believed was lost. The challenge now would be guiding her back to the truth of who she was, and to the mother who had never stopped waiting. He felt the weight of that task, but he also felt hope rising in his heart. For all the silence of the forgotten worlds, he knew he had uncovered a story that could change the Dominion forever. The days that followed were filled with quiet tension for Thomas. He had found Alira, the young woman who carried the royal mark, but discovery was only the beginning. Now came the harder part. How could he speak to her about who she truly was without breaking the fragile trust she had shown him? How could he convince her that she was not only a settler, but the long-lost daughter of a queen whose sorrow had become a legend? Alira continued her daily life in the colony, tending to fields, repairing tools, and helping neighbors. She was well loved in the community. Thomas noticed how often people turned to her when disputes rose. She had a calm presence, a way of listening to both sides before speaking with fairness. The settlers valued her wisdom, though she was still young. Tomas saw in her the reflection of Queen Arya, who was known for guiding with both strength and compassion. This gave him hope, but it also reminded him of the great responsibility that lay ahead. One evening, after the work of the day was done, Tomas asked Alira to walk with him beyond the colony. They followed a path through tall grass until they reached a hill where the twin suns were lowering into the horizon. The sky glowed in shades of orange and gold, and the stars began to shine faintly above. Thomas spoke carefully. He told her of the lost princess, the child who had vanished during the uprising, and of the songs sung across the Dominion about her. Alira listened with quiet eyes. She asked him why he shared these stories with her, and he simply pointed to the mark on her wrist. Alira pulled her sleeve back and looked at the faint glow that had always puzzled her. She admitted that since childhood, the settlers had told her it was a gift of birth, something rare but harmless. She had never questioned it deeply, though sometimes in her dreams she had seen halls of stone and gardens filled with light, places that did not exist in the colony. Thomas said softly that perhaps those were not just dreams but memories. For a long time, Alira said nothing. She stood on the hill watching the stars. At last she asked what it would mean if his story were true. Would she be expected to leave behind the only home she had ever known? Would strangers demand that she play the role of a princess she had never chosen to be? Thomas answered with honesty. He said he could not decide her path for her, but he believed her mother still waited. He believed the queen's heart would never stop hoping. Alira turned her face away, hiding the emotion that rose in her eyes. The following days were restless for her. She carried out her duties, but her thoughts wandered. Each time she looked at the mark on her wrist, she felt as if it called to her. She asked questions of the elders in the colony, but they gave her only gentle words. They admitted she had been brought to them as a child with no family, during days of trouble. They had loved her and raised her as their own, but they knew little beyond that. This confirmation shook her. It was not proof, but it was enough to open her heart to Thomas's story. One night, unable to sleep, Alira walked again to the hill. The stars stretched endless above her, and for the first time she wondered what worlds lay among them. She thought of the queen, a mother she had never met, and wondered if the bond between them could still exist across such distance and time. She whispered to the sky, asking silently who she truly was. In that moment she felt both fear and longing. She did not know if she wanted to believe, yet she could not turn away from the possibility. Tomas gave her space, never pressing too hard. Instead, he shared simple things. He played for her recordings of songs from Dominion worlds. He showed her maps of constellations and explained the history of the uprising. Slowly, piece by piece, he let her see that the galaxy was wider than the colony, that her life might hold more than she had ever imagined. Alira listened, sometimes with awe, sometimes with doubt, but always with growing curiosity. The turning point came when Thomas showed her the old recordings he had found in the ruined outpost. They spoke of a child hidden away for safety, cared for by settlers marked by starlight. The voice of the caretaker in those recordings was filled with devotion, promising to protect her until the end. Alira listened with trembling hands. She recognized the name they used for the child. It was the same name she had been given, Alira. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized that her life had not begun in the colony as she had always believed. She had been carried there from another place, a place connected to a story far larger than herself. In the days that followed, Alira wrestled with her heart. Part of her wanted to cling to the safety of the life she knew. She loved the settlers who had raised her. They were her family, her friends, her world. To leave them felt like breaking a promise. Yet another part of her yearned to uncover the truth. If her mother truly waited for her, how could she ignore that? How could she deny the bond of family that stretched across the stars? Thomas remained by her side, offering patience. He told her she did not need to decide quickly. He reminded her that being human, he understood what it meant to face choices without clear answers. Humans, he said, often stepped into the unknown not because they were certain, but because they were willing to try. Alira smiled faintly at his words. She saw in him not only a guide, but also a friend who cared for her beyond the weight of her past. The colony, too, felt the change. Whispers spread among the settlers as they noticed Alira's restlessness and her quiet conversations with Thomas. Some feared losing her, for she had become the heart of their community. Others, however, believed she was meant for something greater. They told her gently that no matter where she went, she would always be their daughter, always welcome if she chose to return. Their kindness strengthened her, even as it made the choice more painful. At last, Alira stood before Thomas and said she was ready. She wanted to see the galaxy beyond the colony. She wanted to know the truth of her birth. Fear remained in her voice, but her eyes held determination. Thomas felt pride in her courage. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be doubts, challenges, and perhaps resistance from those who saw her return as a threat. But he also knew that hope had been born in her heart, and that was stronger than fear. As Thomas prepared his ship, Alira walked one last time through the fields of the colony. She touched the hands of those who had raised her, promising she would not forget them. She carried with her a small pendant, a gift from the settlers as a reminder of the life that had shaped her. When she boarded the ship, she turned back for a final look at the world that had been her only home. The suns glowed behind her, and the people waved with both sorrow and joy. Then the doors closed, and the engines lifted them into the sky. In the silence of space, Alira sat by the window staring at the stars. She felt both small and infinite, as if her life had been broken open to reveal a horizon she had never imagined. Thomas sat beside her, giving her quiet company. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she truly was the daughter of a queen. She did not know what awaited her, but she knew her journey had begun. And so, as the ship left the frontier and set its course toward the heart of the Dominion, the story of the lost princess moved forward. A daughter who had vanished in sorrow was now on the path to return, guided not by power or armies, but by the persistence of a human who refused to let her story fade into silence. The stars stretched endlessly as Thomas's ship carried Alira away from the only home she had ever known. The hum of the engines was steady, a constant rhythm beneath their silence. Alira sat at the window, her eyes fixed on the glittering constellations. She had dreamed of the stars since childhood, but now they were no longer distant lights. They were paths, each one leading her toward a truth she could not yet fully grasp. Beside her, Thomas watched with quiet care. He knew she was leaving behind more than just a colony. She was leaving behind a life built on safety, simplicity, and love. Ahead lay uncertainty, and with it a chance to reclaim the bond of family that time had almost erased. The first days of the journey were filled with questions. Alira wanted to know about the Dominion, about the palace, about the queen who might be her mother. Thomas told her stories he had heard in his travels. He described the great city of the capital world, with towers that reached toward the sky and gardens that shone with crystal fountains. He spoke of Queen Arya's wisdom, her voice that carried both strength and comfort, and the way her people respected her not only as a ruler, but as a symbol of endurance. Alira listened with wide eyes, but doubt often crept into her heart. Could she truly belong to such a world? Could she, a girl raised among settlers, ever stand in those halls without feeling like an outsider? Thomas reminded her gently that truth was not always about being ready. Sometimes it was about being willing. Humans, he explained, often walked into the unknown not with certainty but with courage. Alira held on to those words, finding in them a fragile strength. Still, in the quiet hours of the night, she wondered if she was strong enough for what lay ahead. Their journey was not without challenge. The frontier was vast, filled with stations where news traveled slowly and politics shifted like sand. At one outpost, Thomas and Alira heard whispers of her story. The lost princess was not forgotten. Traders sang ballads of the child who had vanished, and some spoke of prophecies that claimed her return would mark a new age for the Dominion. Alira felt uneasy hearing her life described in songs and myths. She did not feel like a symbol. She was simply herself. Yet the settlers' words gave her a glimpse of how deeply her disappearance had touched the galaxy. At another stop, Thomas spoke quietly with old captains who warned him to be careful. Not all would welcome the princess's return. Some feared the change her presence might bring. Ambitious ministers might seek to control her. Rivals of the queen might see her as a threat. Thomas listened without alarm. He had expected as much. But when Alira asked him if they should turn back, he shook his head. He told her that a life lived in hiding was no true life at all. The only way forward was to face the truth, whatever it might be. As they traveled deeper into Dominion space, Alira began to see the variety of worlds for the first time. She saw marketplaces filled with traders from a dozen species, each one speaking with different voices yet sharing the same desire to connect. She saw farms that stretched across continents feeding entire sectors. She saw children laughing on stations, their games echoing through the metal halls. With each sight, she realized how vast the Dominion was and how much her absence had mattered without her ever knowing it. She felt both awe and pressure, as though the galaxy itself was waiting for her. During one long night of travel, Thomas showed her a holo of Queen Aria recorded during a speech years earlier. The queen's voice was calm, steady, and filled with quiet power. Her eyes held sorrow yet also unbreakable resolve. Alira stared at the image, unable to look away. She felt a strange pull in her heart, as though she recognized something familiar. It was not proof, but it was enough to bring tears to her eyes. She whispered that perhaps the bond of a mother and daughter could endure even across the years. Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, saying nothing, for he knew her heart was already answering the question. As they approached the central regions, the journey grew more difficult. Officials at checkpoints asked questions. Some looked at Alira with curiosity, others with suspicion. Thomas used his skills as a traveler to guide them through, always offering simple answers and moving on before curiosity became too sharp. Alira noticed how he spoke with patience, never raising his voice, never showing fear. She admired this quality in him. She realized that his human persistence and calm were the very reasons she trusted him with her future. At last, they entered the space surrounding the capital world. The sight stole Alira's breath. The planet gleamed like a jewel, surrounded by rings of stations and ships. Towers shone even from orbit, reflecting the light of the sun. It was a place of grandeur unlike anything she had ever imagined. For a moment, she wanted to turn away. The world seemed too great, too far from the life she knew. But Thomas reminded her that even the tallest towers were built one stone at a time. Even queens had once been children. Alira nodded, holding on to his words like a lifeline. News of their arrival spread quickly. Within hours, whispers moved through the capital that a traveler had brought a young woman bearing the royal mark. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others grew restless with curiosity. The palace council gathered in urgent meetings, debating what this could mean. Could it truly be the lost princess? Or was this a trick, a story crafted for attention? The queen herself heard the reports with trembling hands. She had waited for years, her hope dimming but never gone. Now she stood on the edge of an answer she had dreamed of but scarcely allowed herself to expect. Before they could enter the palace, Thomas and Alira were brought before a group of officials. They asked questions, examined the mark on her wrist, and compared her features to the records of the lost child. Alira stood silently, her heart pounding, while Thomas spoke with calm assurance. He presented the recordings from the outpost, the testimony of settlers, and the pieces of history he had gathered. The officials could not dismiss what they saw. Though they argued, though some doubted, the truth shone too clearly to be ignored. At last, they agreed that Alira should be brought to the queen. The journey through the palace was like walking into another world. Marble halls stretched into the distance, filled with carvings and banners of history. Servants and guards paused to watch as Alira passed, their eyes wide with awe. Thomas walked beside her, steady as always, reminding her to breathe, reminding her she was not alone. At the end of the hall, tall doors opened into the throne room. The air was heavy with silence. The queen stood waiting. Alira's steps slowed. The sight of Queen Aria struck her with a force she could not explain. The queen was older than the image she had seen in the hollow. Her hair touched with silver, her face lined with years of rule. Yet her eyes were the same, calm, strong, and filled with sorrow. Those eyes now widened with a hope so deep it threatened to break. For a moment, neither mother nor daughter spoke. The galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. Thomas stepped back, leaving the space between them clear. He had guided Alira this far, but the next steps were hers alone. He watched as Queen Arya slowly descended from her throne, her hands trembling. Alira, with tears filling her eyes, raised her wrist to show the mark of starlight. The queen reached out, her voice breaking as she whispered her daughter's name. And in that moment, the years of silence, loss, and waiting began to fall away. The journey home was not finished, for the bond of family had to be rebuilt after so much time. But the first steps had been taken. Against all odds, across forgotten paths and through doubt and fear, a human wanderer had guided the lost princess back to her mother. The palace walls, long silent with sorrow, were filled with hope once more. And though challenges still lay ahead, the story of the lost child was no longer one of despair. It had become a story of return, of endurance, and of the quiet strength that humans carried with them across the stars. The great throne room of the Serail Palace remained hushed long after the first meeting between Queen Arya and her daughter. For years, the hall had witnessed formal gatherings, speeches, and the business of government. But now it held something deeper. It held the sound of a mother whispering her child's name and the quiet breath of a daughter realizing she had been found. The guards, the counselors, and even Thomas, who had stood steady through every trial, felt the weight of the moment. The story of the vanished princess was no longer a tale carried by poets or traders. It was real. It was alive. Alira stood before the queen, her heart beating like a drum. She felt both close and far away, as though the hall stretched endlessly between them, yet at the same time she sensed a bond that distance and time could not erase. Queen Arya, who had ruled with patience and sorrow for so long, stepped forward. Her hands trembled, her eyes filled with tears that had been held back for decades. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and touched her daughter's cheek. It was the simplest of gestures, yet it carried the weight of the years she had waited. Alira closed her eyes and leaned into that touch, and the hall seemed to breathe again. The queen did not cry out or call for celebration. Instead, she pulled Alira into her arms and held her, quietly and firmly, as if to prove to herself that this was no dream. The counselors turned their eyes away, giving the queen her moment. Thomas, watching, felt his own throat tighten. He had promised the stars he would bring the lost daughter home, but even he had not imagined the tenderness of this reunion. When at last the queen released her, she guided Alira to sit beside her on the steps of the throne. The ministers, still stunned, exchanged glances, but no one dared interrupt. Queen Arya lifted her head and spoke, her voice steady, though touched with emotion. She declared before all who were present that her daughter had returned, not through armies or decrees, but through the courage of a human who had refused to let the story fade. The hall echoed with the weight of her words, and those who doubted now bowed their heads in respect. The days that followed were filled with questions. Officials needed proof. Records were examined, the mark on Alira's wrist studied, and stories from the settlers confirmed. Piece by piece, the truth could no longer be denied. The lost princess had come home. News spread across the Dominion faster than trade winds. On distant worlds, people gathered in markets to hear the announcement. Songs were sung anew, but now with joy rather than sorrow. The queen's long grief had ended, and with it the legend of the vanished child was transformed into a living chapter of history. Alira, however, felt both wonder and unease. She had been raised as a settler, not as a royal. She was used to carrying baskets, repairing tools, and sharing simple meals with neighbors. The palace, with its tall windows and marble halls, felt like another world entirely. Servants bowed when she passed, and counselors measured her with watchful eyes. She often asked Thomas if she truly belonged here. Thomas reminded her that identity was not built in a day. He told her that even a queen's daughter could carry the heart of a settler. She smiled at that, though sometimes the weight of expectation pressed heavily upon her shoulders. Queen Arya was gentle. She did not demand that Alira step into her role quickly. Instead, she spent long evenings walking with her through the palace gardens, answering questions about family history, and listening to Alira speak of the colony that had raised her. They shared stories, laughter, and even silence, as if trying to fill the empty years with new memories. The queen found joy in these quiet times, for they reminded her that she had not lost everything. Alira, in turn, discovered that the woman she had feared meeting was not only a ruler, but a mother whose love had never faded. Thomas remained close, though he did not seek the center of attention. He had guided Alira this far, and now he stood ready to help as she learned to walk between two worlds. Many in the palace watched him with curiosity. Some wondered why a human, A traveler from a young species had been the one to succeed where all others had failed. The queen answered that question herself. She told her council that humans possessed a rare gift. They did not give up when the path grew uncertain. They carried with them a persistence that could light even the darkest road. Thomas, she said, was living proof of that. Over time, trust grew between Alira and the court. She attended meetings, listened to the debates of ministers, and asked questions that revealed her thoughtful nature. Though she lacked the polish of royal training, her honesty and fairness reminded many of the queen herself. People began to see not only a daughter returned but a leader in the making. Yet Alira never forgot her roots. She often spoke of the settlers, of their kindness and resilience. She told the council that the strength of the Dominion did not lie only in palaces and fleets, but also in small communities where people lived with dignity, even in hardship. The queen encouraged her voice, proud of the balance Alira carried. The mother who had once mourned in silence now found joy in guiding her daughter's steps. Together they began to heal not only their bond but also the memory of the uprising. For years, that chapter of history had been spoken of only with pain. Now, with the princess returned, it became a story of endurance and reunion, a reminder that even in loss, hope could survive. When the time came to address the people, Queen Arya chose not to stand alone. She stood with Alira at her side and Thomas nearby so all could see. The palace square was filled with citizens, and beyond, the speech was carried across every world of the Dominion. The queen spoke of sorrow and waiting, of the child who had been taken by history but not by despair. She told them that it was through a human traveler's persistence that the lost daughter had been found. She lifted Thomas's name with honor, and the crowd cheered not only for their princess but for the humanity that had given her back to them. Alira then stepped forward. She did not speak with the practiced voice of a trained orator, but her words were clear and true. She thanked the settlers who had raised her, calling them her first family. She thanked Thomas for showing her the courage to seek the truth, and she thanked her mother for never letting go of hope. Her voice trembled at times, but her sincerity carried farther than eloquence. The people saw in her not a distant figure of legend, but a young woman with a heart both humble and strong. Their cheers rose high, and the songs that followed carried through the night. In the days that followed, envoys from other civilizations came to offer their respect. Many spoke of how they had heard the tale of the vanished princess for years, never expecting it would one day find such an ending. They marveled that a human had been at the center of it. Thomas accepted their words with modesty, reminding them that he had only followed the path set before him. Yet deep inside, he knew he had witnessed something greater than himself. He had seen how a single act of persistence could change the course of history. As time moved forward, Alira began to find her place between her two lives. She walked the palace halls with dignity, yet she also visited villages, listening to common people and sharing meals as if she were still among settlers. She believed that a true leader must understand both the heights of power and the roots of ordinary life. Her mother supported her in this, and together they wove a vision of a dominion built not only on strength but also on compassion. The people loved her for it, and songs of the princess who returned grew louder and more joyful with each passing season. For Queen Arya, the pain of years could not be erased, but it could be healed. She found peace in the presence of her daughter, and her heart, once heavy with sorrow, now carried hope. The palace that had long stood in silence once again echoed with laughter. The halls that had felt cold now shone with warmth. And in every corner of the Dominion, from distant colonies to bustling capitals, people felt that the return of the princess marked a new chapter of unity. For Thomas, the wanderer who had once traveled alone, this journey gave him more than he had ever expected. He had not sought glory, yet he found honor. He had not sought power, yet he changed the fate of a galaxy. More than that, he had found a family of sorts, bound not by blood but by trust and gratitude. Wherever he traveled in the future, he would carry with him the memory of the queen's embrace, the princess's courage, and the songs of a people who had been given back their hope. And so the story of the vanished child came to its true ending. It was not a tale of loss but of return, not of despair but of persistence. Across the stars, people remembered that it was a human, guided by curiosity and compassion, who had brought light back into the heart of the Dominion. In the throne room of the palace, a mother and daughter sat side by side, their bond restored, their laughter filling the air. And above them the stars continued to shine, as if marking the truth that hope, once kindled, can never truly fade.